Hey folks, before we get started, I got a little announcement to make. If you want to support us financially, you can head over to our Patreon account, which is linked in the show description of this episode and every episode. This financial support will help us keep the lights on here at Taos Slopes and free us up to continue to create more of that content that you gotta have. So if you're finding Taos Slopes valuable, please consider supporting us in this fashion. Members of our Patreon will receive an exclusive bonus episode each week where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some subject matter, whether that's something that we're pulling from the regular episodes, some media that we saw that we just have to comment on, or just some random thoughts that we think that you all will find interesting to tag along with. So, again, look for the link in our show description of this podcast episode, and we thank you. Hi, I'm Justin Janetzko. I'm a former educator and chaplain for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and now mostly interested in aspects of humanism.
Hi, I'm Kris Bobbianco. I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist community and enjoy challenging myself and growing through conversations.
Welcome to the Taos Slopes podcast.
If you're questioning the legitimacy of your Christian experience, you're not alone. We've been there too.
That's why we're here. We're going to call out and condemn the toxic behavior and senseless narratives perpetuated by Christians, and we'll provide credible counterpoints and bring the receipts.
Join us as we confront and weigh in on some of the craziest things Christians think, say, and do that often go unchecked.
Here on the Taos Slopes podcast. Kris, do you ever go to art museums?
Yes, I love them.
You do?
I do. It's my favorite thing to walk around and make my own commentary on the art pieces.
Oh.
Yeah, that's half the fun of it. You know, you don't do the serious art contemplation, but you just have fun.
Oh, so you're not really a serious person.
Hey!
When you go to art museum, what's your favorite display or set of displays?
I mean, I guess it depends on what art museum you're going to.
Okay, can you give us an example, though?
Yes.
Of what you might like?
My favorite art museum that I ever went to was in Seattle. It was the Chihuly glass sculpture one. It was just a bunch of blown glass sculptures. It was really beautiful.
That is awesome.
Really cool.
I myself, I enjoy art museums. I really like pieces about the civil rights movement. I find those fascinating. When I'm at an art museum, though, I do have to say there is something at every single art museum I've ever been to that I can't help but notice.
Okay.
There are a lot of penises at the art museum.
I was like, in my mind, I was like, maybe you weren't going that direction, but I kind of had a feeling. I mean, you're not wrong.
We all know it's true, right? You pull up to any art museum and you're going to see drawings, illustrations, you're going to see paintings, you're going to see sculptures of peen. I mean, sculptures, Kris. Somebody took their hands and they sculpted.
I think you're thinking about it a little too much.
I am thinking about it because it's there for me to contemplate. What else am I supposed to do? Look, here's the point. I don't know much about this world or this life. But one thing I do know is where there's a blank canvas, somebody's drawn a penis.
That's sad, but it's true.
No, it's absolutely true.
It's so true.
And it actually reminds me of a story. Kris, I know how much you love my stories. I'm going to serve you up another one.
Well, let's hear it.
One of the schools that I used to work at as a chaplain, when I was working for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we had this just amazing, and even at the time, it was a brand new auditorium that I was privileged to use for programming. But this auditorium, it was beautiful. I loved it so much. It was state-of-the-art. It was just wonderful space for all sorts of great student programming, and our staff was really protective over that space. We wanted to keep it as clean and unspoiled as possible. We had no eating or drinking rules, because, you know, kids do be messy. Let's face it, adults do be messy too.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody's messy when they eat and drink. Slobs. We had this really amazing theater seating with these nicely, pristinely upholstered chairs. Kids always wanted to kick back, relax, put their feet up on them. Said, nope, don't do it.
Anytime you have kids, it's going to be a struggle to keep things clean.
That's right. That's where the phrase, this is why we can't have nice things, comes from.
Exactly.
And I thought that a lot of times while we were in that space. Now, one thing that everybody has to understand is that the kids would like to use this space to do video projects, rehearse on the piano, rehearse their other instruments, and for the most part, we would allow them to be in there by themselves, sometimes unsupervised.
Dangerous.
Kind of depended on who it was. I mean, in retrospect, looking back, it's like...
Yeah, that's fair.
Maybe that was a little bit too much trust to have extended. But after years of keeping that space more or less in impeccable condition, I remember I walked in there one morning to get a program ready, and as I'm walking to the backstage, to go through the doors to get to the back behind the stage, I noticed that somebody had created some zesty graffiti.
Ooh, a little art museum history?
On the auditorium wall.
Beautiful.
It was a penis that somebody decided to draw. And I'm thinking to myself, not good, not what we want.
Not in the chapel.
It was not a large drawing. It was pretty small, but it was done in pen, and it was noticeable enough. All the walls in there were blank, so anything that would appear on them was noticeable. Stand out. Yeah, it was just standing out like crazy. So I took a picture of it to send to the administration. It was weird looking. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I still have the picture somewhere on my hard drive, but it was weird looking. I just was hoping it wasn't a self-portrait. But
oh gosh,
some kid. But whatever the case was, we got together with the administration. We were able to. I think we ended up painting over it, but the administration was like, "We can't have kids in there by themselves any longer. That's just not going to fly. They've got to be in there only with supervision, adult supervision." And so I said, okay, that's fine. Not a problem. We'll take that new rule and we'll apply it liberally to the student body. So it became a problem for some of the students eventually as they wanted to get in there, like maybe during their lunchtime. If they finish their lunch early, they want to go practice piano. I'll be like, well, do you have an adult to go in there with you? And they're like, no. I was like, well, I'm very sorry. You can't go in there. Oof. They said, why? I said,
what are you supposed to say?
There's a school rule now that was implemented that says no students are allowed there unsupervised. Well, they didn't know why. And so it led to all sorts of speculation as to why they were not allowed in there unsupervised.
Of course.
Now, eventually I told like a few students what had actually happened, but most of the students, they never knew the truth about that law, but it didn't ever stop them from speculating based on their own interpretations of the situation. Ultimately, they only understood the law through their own perspective, whether it was correct or not. And that has happened over and over again, historically speaking, particularly with understanding the rules and the laws in the Bible. We know that they're there,
but we don't know why.
But oftentimes we don't know why they're there.
Because it was a long time ago.
Yeah. So today we're wrapping up our analysis on the paragraph from episodes 2 and 3, which originally appeared in the Homophobes worksheet discussed in episode 2. Hopefully, up to this point, our analysis has been helpful to you all in some way, shape, or form in pointing out some of the absurdities of conservative Christian logic and teachings. Well, Kris, we're not quite done.
Not surprising. There's so much there.
Yeah, there's at least one more point that I would like to make about this paragraph, even though, as we said many times, that paragraph deserves a lot more scrutiny. But let's not beat the dead horse any more than we already have. But I want to get into just a little bit more nitty-gritty here regarding the first text that was used in the first sentence of the paragraph, which would be the which passage?
Leviticus 18.
The Leviticus 18 passage. Now, that passage in Leviticus 18 has been used on repeat over and over and over again to condemn modern-day same-sex relationships and love. And to be honest, that text simply stated by itself with no other context, I mean, I can see how that would
vaguely,
kind of at least start to make sense. I still think there's a lot more to that verse than even as a standalone that complicates it, but we'll probably get into that later on in a future episode. We'll see. The problem for conservatives, however, is that verse is not simply there by itself, or even appearing in the context of a same-sex musing of any kind, right?
Right.
It's not as if God and Moses are having a conversation and God's like, now let me tell you about people who are gay. People that love each other very dearly, but they are same sex. Let's talk about that, Moses.
It wasn't even in the ballpark. Like, come on.
It's not there. Yeah, it's just not there. But instead, Leviticus 18:22, it exists in a context which I think is very rarely discussed by those quoting the verse to condemn same-sex relationships in our modern day. So that's incredibly irritating. There's more to the story if you would just only read a little bit more around that one verse. Now, particularly in the Torah, or the Pentateuch as it's called, first 5 books of the Bible, which is where Leviticus is found, these Mosaic laws, they don't stand alone. These laws exist in the form of a narrative that has to be understood to recognize why these laws exist. And this is why a lot of times when we read these Old Testament laws, they don't make any sense to us on their own.
Yeah, there are some rules within Leviticus that are very strange sounding.
Indeed.
The one that I commonly think of, or that pops up first in my mind, is the one about having more than one fabric. What is it? It's you do not wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of material.
Yeah, very naughty.
It sounds like it'd be really boring clothing. That's all I'm saying. But anyway, regardless.
I think so.
If you read through Leviticus 19, that's where that verse is found in Leviticus 19:19. Keep going to the end of the chapter. It has the strangest little laws that when you're just reading this by itself, pretty much make no sense. It's just strange. Why? Okay. For example, in Leviticus 19:23, it says, when you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years, you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all of its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In this way, your harvest will be increased.
But I'm so hungry.
That's what I'm saying. You go and plant a tree in a new land, and you have to wait 5 years to eat its fruit.
Yeah, so we see laws like that, and quite frankly, we will not be able to understand those laws through the lens of our modern time.
Right.
They're just not going to make any sense. That's not to say that we can't understand them, but in order to understand them, we're going to have to understand them in the narrative in which Leviticus and those laws were given. And then eventually, what the narrative was when it was written. Maybe they're the same, maybe not. We literally have no way of knowing. We're just dealing with the text, right?
Right.
Now, whether you like it or not, all those laws and our law of Leviticus 18:22, it exists in the context of a larger narrative. That's how laws work, right? So, think about it like this. Most facilities with a lot of foot traffic, like schools or libraries or places like that, they have rules, spoken or otherwise, that address running.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, something along the lines of, usually,
no running.
No running. You fool. Why does that rule exist?
Well, if you ask a kid, they'll have a different answer than if you ask an adult.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, when I was a kid at school, my interpretation of that rule was that teachers just didn't like running kids. I know that sounds very stupid, and I guess I was. But no, seriously, that's what I thought. I was like,
I think a lot of kids
there's a
think
lot
that.
of great space to run here.
Right.
We want to get from point A to point B. You're excited in school as a kid. Exactly. Let me go fast. Why don't you want me to go fast? I want to go fast. And that's kind of what I ended up thinking was well, they're just authoritarian rulers that, it's a power grab, basically. However, the real answer to that question is a lot larger than just the rule by itself, right?
Exactly.
And one's interpretation of it as well. Now, obviously, my interpretation changed once I got some knowledge and some psycho kid was tearing down the hallway and ran into somebody else and they hit heads. Ooh. And then they all bled all over the floor.
Ouch. Oh, my gosh.
And I'm sitting over them thinking,
well, that's why.
Oh, okay. Y'all might want to clean that up. So the light turned on, right? That rule was there to protect people.
Wow.
What? Protect people. It had a purpose, but also a story or a narrative behind it that gave it value and explained its very presence in the school. Isn't that remarkable?
Yeah,
how that works.
It's interesting how when you know the context, it makes the rules sound different.
Yes,
what
indeed.
Do you know about that? Speaking of random laws that when you do not know the story behind them, they sound very strange. There are these 2 laws that I found about Ohio specifically.
Ohio?
Yeah, we're recording in Ohio, so I look for Ohio laws.
Ohio.
And, sorry, I missed it. My bad. Right. Okay, anyways.
I forgive you.
All right, according to Ohio law, it is against the law to kill a housefly within 160 feet of church without a license. That is a true thing.
Where do you get that license from? Does it say?
It did not say. It just was on a list of absurd laws that was given by a law firm.
I just picture some guy getting his fishing license or something and saying, you know what, since I'm here, I might as well spring for the fly killing license.
I want to know if
license.
all the pastors and all of those have to get that license.
That's a great question.
Yeah, do they? Otherwise, they can't kill the flies.
You know what? I'll ask some of my pastor friends.
Yeah, please do.
And
That'd be great.
If they don't, I'm going to report them.
I want to know. And then this other one I found that was very interesting, considering Ohio is land-bound. 1, it is illegal to fish for whales on a Sunday. Where are we getting whales? I'm serious.
Wait, is that?
It's illegal to fish for whales on Sunday.
Okay, that's confusing. But here's something else that's confusing about that. A whale's not a fish, so do you fish for a whale?
That's a great question. I don't know.
Or do you mammal for a whale?
That was the direct way the law was written when it was on Casper. It was like a Casper law firm.
I do be mammalin.
Mammalin?
But not on Sunday in Ohio. It's when you fish for a whale. Mammalin.
Oh,
I'm mammalin.
Okay. That's interesting.
That's really weird. But you know what? If we wanted to actually understand where those laws came from, we could do our due diligence and we could figure it out, right? Because we understand something that I wish everybody would understand. It just seems like they don't. That laws have stories behind them.
Right. There's a reason for these random laws. Someone did something. Something happened.
Yeah. Well, Leviticus 18 is no different than any other law or set of laws. It actually exists within a narrative, and like I mentioned earlier, I think it's rarely discussed, and maybe even never discussed in full context when it's used, particularly by conservatives. They usually just pull out the single text and drop it there as if there's not more qualifying information around it. It's like, come on, you all know how to read, right? You all know better. And look, pastors, I see you all, pastors. I know you're doing it, and I know you should know better.
You went to school.
You went to school. What is going on here? So this behavior and practice can change the entire meaning of the text, but if you are using that text and that text alone to make a point, you are never going to get to the larger picture, and thus you're going to miss the truth of what the author was actually trying to say.
It reminds me of the old bookmark that I used to have, where all the teachers, I think it was in like elementary school, would give the students these little bookmarks of how to figure out what the context was of a sentence that made no sense. And it had like little action figures on it, like search around the sentence or like reread it. And I'm just like, do we need to get that for the Bible?
That sounds fun.
Yeah, just like instead of the little little fabric little bookmark that's in there, it's just one of those context clues bookmarks. Strategies for smart reading.
Okay, like as lame as that sounds, so, teachers always think like a bookmark is a great present to give you if you win a prize or something like that. It's that's like, so hey, true. You got straight A's. Here's a bookmark. And you're like, I'd rather have money though. So
same.
Well, the fact of the matter is that Leviticus is actually pointing us to an example of exactly why this law exists. It's just that we're not reading enough of that passage to actually notice it. And as always, we actually don't have to just assume or guess what the author is attempting to say, or even plug in our own thoughts. Let the author author.
Let the author author.
Is that it? Let the author tell us what's going on.
Okay, that's
better. What I mean. Mammaline. So, let's go and see for ourselves. Let me show you what all of this means. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Buckle up. Let's go to Leviticus 18, and you're going to see, Chris, I don't know if you know this, but there's more to Leviticus 18 than just one passage.
What?
Yes.
Really? No way.
Leviticus 18:22 sits amongst other verses.
What? There's not 21 verses before 22?
I'm shocked. Ugh. Yeah. So if you just do your due diligence and you read the whole chapter at least, you really ought to read the entire book, you're going to realize that. And if you start reading Leviticus 18, it starts by pointing us in the direction of the narrative, the very narrative that has inspired these laws. Why are we not hearing about that ever?
Because no one wants to read.
That's very true. That's very true. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's read it. Let's read it ourselves.
Let's do it.
We're not going to read all of it, but we're going to get y'all started here. If you go to Leviticus 18, starting in verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God."
That sounded so dramatic.
sounds about to spit some bars, but I am the Lord your God. You should take your head and nod. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. Okay, let's stop even just right there. You must not do as they do in Egypt. What does that even mean?
This is talking about when they were slaves in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a narrative.
Right.
There's a story behind it. It's not that God is just whipping up some laws. He's actually framing this. He's giving us the context in which these laws are going to come from. You must not do as they do in Egypt where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. So no matter where you are, you must not be like these people.
That sounds hard. But okay.
You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my laws and decrees, yada, yada, yada. So whatever we are going to read next, the author is saying that it needs to be read in light of what Egypt and Canaan has done in the past. That is what the author is saying.
Yes.
Not some pastor or some Bible study. That's what the author of Leviticus is saying. So let's read some of these laws real quick here, just to kind of get a feeling of what maybe what Egypt and Canaan are guilty of. Shame.
Oh, no.
It says, let's pick it up here in verse 6. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. I like how it repeats that. Like, come on, bro.
Like, come on, have common sense.
Do not have relations with her. Keep on going. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister. And it just keeps on going on and on and on. And as you read these laws, the direction and the intended subjects of the laws become more clear. In other words, these laws were not just written to everybody within the camp of Israel. These laws are specifically written for powerful men who would have the ability, back then at least, to do these things and get away with them because they're powerful men.
Right.
Period. The language is demonstrating that, but the law is limiting their power in certain ways to protect the innocent and the vulnerable.
Yes.
Yes. So as we're reading these laws, that's got to be what we understand. And like, even if you keep on reading here, it talks about like verse 18, do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife. I mean, who back then has wives? It's men, right?
Right.
And even by the time you get to Leviticus 18:22, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. Like it's talking directly to men, right?
To men, yes.
Yeah, precisely. So, and you'll notice when it does want to address women, it does so in the third person, a woman XYZ.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So as you keep reading, the text actually repeats itself again and again regarding the narrative. Verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations I am going to drive out before you became defiled. So again, the past. This is all a history. They have done these things in the past. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sins, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. And then in verse 27, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. It's so repetitious, right? It's just over and over again. If you were to read before and then even after Leviticus 18:22, you would see,
like, hey, you will not miss this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's right there, and for whatever reason, that's just not discussed. I mean, Kris, what do you know about repetition in literature? What does that even mean when something is repeated over and over again in literature?
It means it's important.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah. And what's really funny is, like, that's what I was taught when I went to school for religious education was, they're like, hey, the Bible, when it repeats something, it's important. Pay attention to it.
And yet it's skipped over again and again and
I'm
again.
like, yeah.
What about that?
What about that, though? Like, I know that's what you're telling me, but
do you believe it?
Do you believe that? Because it doesn't kind of seem like it. So who are these nations? Because it names Egypt and Canaan. Are there any more nations?
I mean, I would assume so.
I mean, maybe.
Yes,
maybe. Israel is interacting with a lot of different nations other than just Egypt and Canaan. But who are these nations and what have they done? Two things before we go any further. So far we've seen this law is clearly not arbitrary.
There's a story behind it.
Yeah, there's a story behind it, but it's also there for a good reason.
True. Okay. That makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. It's not just like God's like, hey, here's some random stuff I'm going to throw at you.
Hey,
why don't you implement this? Yeah. That's not the case. At least that's not what it says here in Leviticus 18. But second, this law has nothing to do with creation. You get my drift?
No, what do you mean?
So a lot of times when conservatives argue that, okay, this is about same-sex relationships.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Okay.
they'll say, well,
It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve.
Precisely. Creation itself points us to, and they could even maybe say, well, this is hearkening back. If it's all read in narrative, that's fine. That narrative then is creation itself. God creates the man and woman.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
But that's not what it says.
It has nothing to do with
Big
that.
problem right there.
Right.
It actually gives us the context. And lo and behold, the context is not creation. Come on, be fair. What does the context say? It's not about order. It's about past behaviors. And this is a huge clue in understanding this 1822 passage. There's a story here, yes, but it's not the creation story.
No.
So what is a story? Well, that story is suspected to have been recorded throughout the Torah or the Pentateuch, right?
Right.
And it would have at that point at least appeared as an oral tradition. Israel is familiar with the patriarchs of the nation, namely Abraham. The Pentateuch makes it out that they are familiar with the extension of Abraham's world, including nations that Abraham would have interacted with. If you want evidence on that, go see Exodus 3. They're talking about Abraham. But how much does Israel and Moses know about these stories? To what degree are they familiar with these stories? Are there stories that are there in the oral tradition that aren't recorded in the Pentateuch? I mean,
I don't know.
It's super unclear. But what we do have, we know that the Pentateuch does emphasize that they had knowledge about the actions of the nations in the Canaan region, from which they could learn from as, I would think, non-examples.
Yeah, this is what you don't want to do.
Yeah, so that at least suggests that they are familiar with at least one story that you and I think informs our Leviticus 18 passage. In the realm of affirmation theology, it's suggested that Sodom is included in those nations that Israel is not to be like. And for me personally, this makes sense because of how the oral traditions were formed. The Pentateuch does an excellent job tracking tribes, who their ancestors were, details, different attributes about them. Again, it's a whole narrative. And in these traditions, the Canaanites were included in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, as this was eventually recorded in Genesis 10 as a record. It actually says this. This is taken from Genesis 10, 18, and 19. It says, later the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon near Gerar as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, as far as Lashes. So anyways, I think that people will tend to argue that Sodom was not actually in Canaan because of that, because Abraham settled what is known as Canaan, and Lot settled outside of Canaan and Sodom. Therefore, Sodom was not in the minds of the Israelites as they had this law narrative. And again, I think that's probably wrong, because of how Canaan and Sodom are linked together through the tradition, but also because the suspected location of Sodom was in the Jordan Plain, which is a pretty relevant area to Israel anyway. So yeah, you can argue over those details, but you're really missing the spirit of the law narrative, which would have certainly included the wickedness of the Canaanites that lived in Sodom. We know that same-sex sexual domination was part of their culture, and it's forbidden in Leviticus 18. I mean, I just think that it's at least relevant to point out that the Israelites did interact with all of that land, including where Sodom was, and maybe that's part of the point, at least in Leviticus 18. So whether we're talking directly about Sodom, which again I think is a good chance, or not, the law narrative is still all about protecting the innocent, which Sodom was ultimately in violation of.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's certainly not forbidding love, which we will not find in the Sodom narrative.
No, that's a good point.
You know?
And I wish that was something that was talked about more often.
Yeah, in fact, let's go ahead and look at that Sodom narrative. We've already talked about it in previous episodes, but now let's do it again in light of what we've already been discovering here about Leviticus 18:22. Yeah, if you look at Genesis 19, we'll just start here in verse 1 and kind of read through it. The two angels, remember there are these two angels that are sent by God to go warn Lot as he's living in Sodom, and they're looking like men.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not
They're
recognized
hiding.
as angelic beings. But the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting there in the gateway of the city. And when he saw them, he got up to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." And they said, "No, we're going to spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him. And they entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread.
Without yeast.
Ugh. And they ate. Before they had gone to bed, though, it says, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called out to Lot, "Where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Are you telling me that all these men are gay?
There's no way.
Like it says both young and old. You got babies
Listen,
that roll up.
you know how hard
Gay
it
babies.
is to find other gay people? Like, you're telling me there's an entire town that's gay?
Well, you
No.
just got to go to Sodom, apparently. Now, to me, that argument has always been super ridiculous, like even just on its face. You keep on reading. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." You know, if all these men are gay, why does Lot offer his daughters?
Exactly. Because there's more than just it being love.
Yeah.
Like, it's not love at all, obviously.
You know, Lot knows where he lives, and he knows who these people are. He knows what this situation is.
So he wouldn't offer his daughters if he didn't have a reason to think it would be a acceptable solution.
Well, it's actually not for these men. They say in verse 9, "Get out of our way." They replied, "This fellow," talk about Lot, "came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." And then they kept on bringing pressure on Lot, and they moved to break the door. Look, to me, that is just a huge giveaway. I know there are conservatives that try to use this story as like to slander same-sex relationships.
Yeah.
That's not what this is.
No.
They say, "We will treat you worse." This is nothing to do with love.
No.
It explicitly says they want to hurt them.
Yes. They're mad that they're there and they are going to do whatever they want. It has nothing to do with love.
And again, the pushback on that one, but they want to have sex with them. People.
Sex doesn't always have to do with love. Come on, guys.
Why do people not... I don't think... It must not be a good faith argument, because we all know that sex doesn't equal love. It can be used in all sorts of negative ways.
Yes.
And primarily throughout history, sex that's not consensual is a lot of times used to dominate other people, to assert power over them. That would make a lot more sense in this narrative
Yes.
than what conservatives are proposing.
And if nothing else, it's non-consensual. That's never a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the perfect example of what Leviticus 18 is talking about, right?
Yes.
It's this example of sexual immorality because it is not loving.
Yes. And it's not protecting the innocent and the vulnerable. It's doing the opposite of that.
Pretty wild. Now, how did history judge Sodom?
It was not good. I mean, they died, so.
Yeah, but like, how did the Israelite nation continue to look back, and the descendants then of the Israelite nation? What did they have to say about Sodom?
Well, there is this text in Ezekiel 16:49 through 50 that talks about it. It says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them, as you have seen."
Yeah, a lot of times when you have people that are affirming, they're trying to like push back against the whole idea that everybody in Sodom was gay, and that's what the issue that God had with them. That's not what it says here. Then they'll be like, "Well, it says that they did detestable things, so that was being gay."
No,
That
because
is
it
such
was
a stretch. Come on.
it's very much a stretch. Like, it specifically gives examples of
Yeah.
what they were doing
Yeah,
wrong.
Again, yeah, y'all got to learn how to read.
Exactly.
Seriously.
If there was a specific problem with them being gay, it would have said so right here.
There's another text that's brought up all the time, too, from Jude 1, verse 7, that actually I don't think is oftentimes brought up much by affirming individuals, but I think it should be brought up because I think that it actually helps us much better understand what's going on in Sodom. Can you read that for us, Chris?
Yeah. Jude 1:7 says, "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire."
And that's when the conservatives drop from the rafters and say, "Aha, gotcha,
You're going
see,
to
they
hell,
were
ha!"
sexually immoral." I don't know about that. Well, they do that.
It
too,
says
yeah.
eternal fire, so I'm sure that's going to happen. I've literally seen it.
You're right. But like, yeah, they're correct.
Yeah.
It's again, a lot of affirmation people will leave that out, but we want to address it, right? Because we want to be
Right.
fair.
Exactly.
They're right. It does talk about sexual immorality,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of stuff that is sexually immoral that is far from a loving, consensual same-sex relationship, right?
Yes. Once again, sex does not equal love.
Because look, I agree completely with that, right? What these men in Sodom were doing
Awful.
was wrong.
So wrong.
They should not be doing that same-sex behavior.
No.
Absolutely. But that's not what we're talking about in 2024.
Yes.
When we're trying to like fight for gay rights and the queer community. That's not what we're talking about here. Why will we just not recognize that and admit that?
I would love
Christians?
to know the answer. Please.
Yeah. So anyways, I personally think that it's pretty unlikely that Sodom was the only group of people, even in that area that Israel was going into, that participated in same-sex domination activities. I mean, historically speaking, every civilization has to some degree done this. Whether it was illegal in their culture or not, accepted or not, these offenses still happen today. I mean, think about how upset Christians will get about a person being gay, but pay like zero attention to domination practices that happen in prison. I mean, like, you hear about
Don't drop the soap.
that, yeah, all that stuff all the time. In my experience, I hear Christians talking about it, but only as a joke. It's like a punchline.
Oh yeah, like I just said it. Don't drop the soap. Like it's totally
Yeah.
like, oh, that's funny. Ha ha ha.
Right. But when was the last time you heard a church leader or a pastor talk about prison reform?
Never.
That's what Leviticus 18 is talking about. That's what's the Genesis 19 with Sodom. That's what it's talking about here. All the clues are pointing to that. Ultimately, as many affirming scholars are suggesting, it appears as if that ancient Jewish oral tradition, and then eventually written down as the Pentateuch, they're given a much different explanation of the Leviticus laws than the conservatives are, right?
Right.
But is it correct?
That's the question.
That is the question, right? And nobody agrees on that, of course.
Of course not.
Of course
Otherwise,
not.
we wouldn't be talking about it.
But, for me personally, it does make a lot of sense. Largely because the Pentateuch is written as a narrative, and it's giving examples in Genesis that allow the Exodus story to make sense. You can easily see the parallels between the Sodom story and what the author is emphasizing in the context of Leviticus 18. I mean, think about it. The themes of power, again, protecting the innocent. It's identifying the narratives that have led to the laws. Also, because Leviticus 18 is throwing it back to the narrative for context, in the Pentateuch, do we have any examples of men marrying other men out of love?
No.
There are none. It's just not there. Do we have examples of men trying to rape other men?
Yes.
We do. We just read it. Come on. That's at least got to be in the discussion here, right?
Please. The point is to emphasize love and de-emphasize, I don't even know if that's a word, but like not
It is now,
emphasize.
folks.
It is now. To not focus on treating other people terribly. Like that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're pulling ideas that end up treating people terribly from the Bible,
What are you doing?
nah,
That's not what
that
being
ain't
a Christian
it.
is about.
That ain't it. Yes, we are using logic and we're using reason and we're focused on love to arrive at our conclusions. But look, folks, if you're going to listen to a Christian try to teach you something about the Bible, please have them thoroughly show you the work, because a lot of times they're just making stuff up. And real quick, the last point that I want to make here, going back to the paragraph from the Homophobes worksheet, if we were to actually read that paragraph in the context of Leviticus 18, and remember Leviticus 20, because Leviticus 18 exists within the context of Leviticus 20, which, if you don't remember, last episode we talked about how that says you got to put these people to death.
Yes.
That is the consequence. Death is the outcome here.
Straight to death.
Yeah. So let's actually go ahead and reread that paragraph with that assumption. So it would say the world says homosexuality is an alternative lifestyle, but the Bible says homosexuality is a sin.
Yes.
God hates what the homosexuals do, but he blank towards each homosexual. It's supposed to say he has patience for them, but not according to Leviticus. Leviticus says
straight to death.
He wants to kill them. He kills each homosexual. He has a death wish for each homosexual. The paragraph goes on. Each of us is like the homosexual because, well, it used to say...
They can't really say that.
Yeah, it used to say that, like, it's because we all have sinned and fallen short. But in this case, no, not everybody is doing that.
Right.
So that sentence is pretty much null and void. Yeah. And the last one here is Christians should treat people who say that they are homosexuals with, it used to be love, but according to the Leviticus context, it's with death. Yeah. Yeah, so again, we have that paragraph is awful. How many times are we going to say that? Repetition, people. And, again, real quick, going back to the whole death thing, like there are a lot of laws in the Mosaic Law, including the Leviticus, where the punishment is death. Look, do we really have Christians today that truly believe that women who are not virgins at the time of their wedding should be killed? I mean, Christians talk a lot about virginity, but I haven't run into too many. They're just like, she was not a virgin when she was married. Death. Bring the community.
I really hope that's not still an issue.
We'll make an event out of it. Or working on the Sabbath. That's another way that you can be put to death by your community.
Bring that up to a bunch of people.
Yeah. I mean, for me, this is all ridiculous, and they're all notions that I reject. But, hey, at the end of the day, you all get to decide for yourselves. Again, we just want to take some time, show you our work. I think there's a lot more to it, but... hey, that's what other episodes are for, and really, that's what your free time is for. You can go and you can do the work, and you can figure this stuff out.
And please do. Do the work yourself, please.
Amen and amen. All right, Kris, we're done here for today. Thank you all so much for joining us, but, I would just feel incredibly shamed if we didn't end this episode with a joke.
Oh, no. What do you have this time?
So one day I went to an art museum, and it was beautiful. Just amazing pieces everywhere I looked. No penises. But I was like, sniffing. Oh, bro, it smells in here.
Oh, no.
What is that smell? And so I go up to one of the people that's working there. I said, excuse me, do you smell something awful? They're like, yeah, we do. I said, well, what is it? And they said, oh, sir, I thought you knew. This is the fart museum.
Wow, that's bad.
So bad that it's good?
No.
Oh, just bad.
It's just bad.
Okay. Duly noted.